Welcome to this video tutorial on macros in Microsoft Excel. Let us start with understanding what a macro is. In simple terms, a macro is a recorded set of instructions and commands that are executed with a single click of a button. When macros are recorded, they run repeatedly, performing the same similar tasks, and this saves you a lot of time and increases your efficiency and accuracy while automating all your repetitive tasks. And with that out of the way, in this video tutorial, I'll walk you through step by step on how you can record and save your macros inside your Excel workbooks, and also how to run and edit your macros. Let's begin. First things first, let us create a blank new workbook from scratch. I'll browse and save it on the desktop for training purposes, and I'll just give it a name. Let's call this one Weekly Timesheets. We're gonna be assuming that we work in the human resources department and we are charged of creating weekly timesheets, and maybe would like to automate this process. The first thing that we need to do is to record ourselves creating the timesheet for the first time, so that next time we need to do the same, it will be just a click of a button, and that's exactly what we're gonna be doing in this video. Now, there are three main file extensions that you need to save this workbook in. Those are the only extensions that can support your macros to run, and one of them is the .xlsm. That's the Excel macro enabled workbook. The other one is the Excel binary workbook .xlsb. That one also supports your macros. And the last one that you can use is the Excel template, the .xltx. Those three file extensions will support your macros to run effectively. For this particular training video, we shall use the Excel enabled workbook, and I'll just go ahead and save this file. What I can do is to rename this worksheet. Maybe I'll call this one red, and in here I'll just type in weekly timesheets, and let's assume we are giving 5,000 per hour. I can as well make this heading a little bit bigger, and because we're gonna be using this hourly rate in our calculations, I'll just click in this number and format it appropriately, and let's give it a name here. I'll call this one hourly rate. Enter on the keyboard. It's now time to start recording our macro, and one thing that I need to do is to turn on the developer tab if it's not showing on your ribbon. And to do that, I'll just right mouse click anywhere in the ribbon, customize the ribbon, and on the far right here, when the Excel options dialog box opens, you'll see all the active main menus that are currently showing on your ribbon, and you can see that the developer tab is not selected. What I need to do is to put a check mark here and say OK. This will now bring the developer tab as part of my main menus or part of my ribbon tab. And when I click in this particular option, I'll see a number of commands and options that I can work with inside the developer tab. And one of the buttons that we're interested in is this one here called the record macro. This is the button that we can use to launch or to start recording the macros. If you do not use this button, check over onto the status bar here. You have a little icon here. If you hover over your mouse, you'll see it says no macros are currently recording. Click here to begin recording a new macro. So those are the two buttons that you can use to launch or start recording your macro. Our interest is to record ourselves creating a weekly timesheet. So I'll just click here in the record macro option, and I need to give this particular macro a name. I'll call mine create new timesheets. That's the name of the macro. You can give it a shortcut key. This is not mandatory. And the other selection that you need to make here is where do you want to store this macro in. By default, it will say this particular workbook, but again, you have an option of creating a new blank workbook or creating a personal macro workbook. I'll be explaining a little bit what are these options and what they can do. The other one is to give a little bit of a description what this macro will be doing. So I'll say this macro is gonna be used to create new timesheets automatically, and you hit the OK button. You can now clearly see that our macro has started recording. You can check here, this button now says stop recording, and when we come over to our button that we had here in the status bar, it now reads a macro is currently recording. Click here to stop the recording. Now, in this particular stage, we need to make sure that we minimize making mistakes. Now, the first step that I will take here is to add a new worksheet. So that step has been recorded. Now, the next thing that I will do is to come over to column C anywhere in any cell, and I can start creating my weekly timesheet. I'll say weekly timesheet, hit enter to move to the next line, and in here I'll say maybe I need to record the staff names. I move over to D5 and punch in any staff name just for training purposes, but I'll show you how to edit this. I press enter to move to the next line, and in here I'll need to record the week start date. I just say week start, and for this one I'll just punch in any value, maybe 1st of January 2023. I'll just jump 2 rows here, and in here I'll just say day or days, and here I'll say hours, and I'll also say totals here. For the days, I'll just punch in Monday and use my fill handle to drag all the way through to Sunday. And down here, I'll also put the total row. For this particular timesheet, we shall need to calculate the total amount depending on the hours worked, and maybe we'd like to compensate people that are working over the weekends for Saturdays and Sundays a little bit different, so we shall need a little bit of if function here. I'll come over to the totals and say equals if I open the all function because I want to check if this particular day is equals to Saturday, or if this particular day is equal to Sunday. I close the all from here, comma, value if true, we shall say hours into the hourly rate that we have just created into 1.5, just as an example to compensate people who are working on the weekends differently, comma, and for value if false, I'll say hours worked into the hourly rate. I close off the if from here and hit enter key on the keyboard. You can see we are getting a 0 in here simply because there are no hours that have been recorded here. I'll drag this formula all the way through up to Sunday, and for the totals here, I'll click in the cell, head back over to the home tab and click on the auto sum here, enter on the keyboard. Now our timesheet is starting to take shape. What we need to do is to actually do a little bit of formatting. I'll come in here for the weekly timesheet as my main title. I'll just make it a little bit bigger. Maybe I can just give it 22 font size and make it bold. I can also change the font color to something else. And for the rest of the text, I'll actually make them maybe 14 font size. And for column C, I'll actually manually enlarge this particular column to make sure that all the text is visible that is sitting in the column. And for column D, I'll just double click auto fit. For this particular headers here, I'll highlight and give them a different fill color, and for the font I'll just make it white and bold. And for our total row down here, let's also give it a different fill color. I'll just go with something like this one here, and let's also highlight this entire table and surround it with all borders. But for the total row right here, I'll make it bold and add a bottom double border. One more thing that we can do is to highlight all the 3 columns, and maybe for our big title here, we just merge and center. Additionally, we may also add a border that surrounds this entire table, one thick border. So I'll just come back to the borders, and the last one that I'll do here is to go back to the review tab and remove the grid lines and click in this particular cell because I'd like users to start punching in the hours worked, and I believe those are the steps that we need to take. Now I'll head back over to the developers tab and stop the recording. Alright, now after recording our macro, the next question should be, how do we run this recorded macro? To do that, you'll head back over to the developers tab, click on this icon here that says macros. Once you do that, this will open this dialog box, and in here you'll get a list of all the available recorded macros. Right now you can see we only have one, which we have just created. It's called create new timesheets. And if I would like to run this particular macro, I have an option here that says run. If I click here once, you'll see that this macro will run and it will create a brand new worksheet at the bottom here, and it will also recreate our timesheet for us automatically. Now what I can do is to come in here and make changes. Maybe I can change the staff name. I can also make changes to the week start date, and I can start punching in the hours for this particular staff member here, and so on and so forth. Of course, this looks amazing and easy to execute, but of course if someone is new to Excel, the best method of running these macros is creating for them a button that they can click and run the macros. I'm going to be showing you 2 methods that we can use to create buttons and assign them macros. So I'll come back to this particular worksheet and head back over to the developers tab, and under the controls here, I'll click in the insert drop down and let us create a button here. We shall pick the first option here and draw our button somewhere here. Once you are comfortable with the shape, you can release your mouse, and immediately you do that, it will ask you to assign a particular macro. Right now we only have one. I'll just click in this one and say okay. So this particular button has been assigned this macro. When I click on this button, it will be able to execute this macro. What I can do is to edit this button one and change it to something else. Maybe I'll say create new timesheet. I can click outside here. When I point back here or I hover over my mouse, you can see the cursor changes into that hand cursor, meaning that I'm able to click on this particular button. Once I do that, you can see immediately the macro will run and it will actually insert a new worksheet and it will recreate this timesheet for us automatically. The other method, if you do not use the form controls here under the developers tab, we can come back to this particular worksheet and head over to the insert tab, and under the illustrations here we can insert any shape of our choice. Let us go with the rectangle with rounded corners here. I'll come and draw it here again. I release my mouse and I can format this shape with the fill color of my choice, and I can also say shape outline, no outline. Right mouse click and edit text. I'll say create new timesheet. I can actually center this particular text in the middle here, make it bold, and the next step is to right mouse click on this shape and assign it a macro. This is the only macro that we have right here. I'll say okay. And now if I would like to execute this macro, I can just click on this button right here, and there you go. You can see this macro will still run and it will insert a new worksheet and recreate this timesheet for us automatically. Now you might be asking yourself, how do I edit a recorded macro? For example, I would like to edit this particular macro and pop in an input box that will allow users punch in the staff names as well as the week start date. So how do we do that? You'll head back over to the developers tab and click in the macros button here, and when this dialog box opens, you have an option to edit this existing macro. So with the macro selected in here, I'll click on the edit button. This will load and open a VBA editor right there, and you can see all the actions that we took have been recorded and turned into lines of codes, as you can see. So we can come in here and make changes to our VBA code, and the changes that we'd like to make is on this line of code. We would like to pop up an input box so that a user can punch in this name, and also we need to edit this line of code so that we can pop in an input box to allow a user punch in the week start date. So what I can do is to come over to this particular line of code. Instead of saying .formula R1C1, I'll say .value. This should be equal to an input box. I open brackets. So the input box prompt here will be, I open double quotes, and I'll say enter staff full names. And for the title of this particular input box, I'll call it full staff names, and close the double quotes and close brackets. So that line of code has been amended. Now I'll also come over to this particular line of code and do the same thing. Instead of .formula R1C1, I'll actually say .value. This should equal to an input box. I'll open parentheses, and for the prompt, I'll open double quotes, enter week start date, comma, and for the title, let's just say week start date. Now we have just implemented two changes to only two lines of VBA code. I can go ahead and save the changes from here, and I'll go ahead and close this window, come back to our worksheet here, and let us execute this macro for now and see what happens. I'll click on this particular button, and there you go. You can see now it prompts me to input the staff full names. I'll just go ahead and punch in anything here. I'll go for Baguma Edward, and I'll say okay. For the second input box, you can see it asking for the week start date. I'll just punch in any date here. Let's say 31st of December 2023. I'll click OK, and immediately you do that, our macro will complete running and it will recreate our timesheet automatically. So that's one example of editing your recorded macro. Next up is how do you record a relative macro reference, and how do you set up trusted locations for your macro security. All that in our next video, but if you enjoyed this one, please give it a like, leave any comment, and do not forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel in case this is your first time here. See you in the next video.